Hey, thanks for having me. My name is Jim Adler. I'm the founding managing director of Toyota AI Ventures. What I thought I would do is give you a little bit about the investment fund and then talk a little bit about where we are in the macro and microeconomic environments and how that really affects at least our investment decisions. And hopefully there's some wisdom here amidst all the chaff. From Toyota AI Ventures perspective, what are we trying to do? Why is Toyota really doing a venture capital fund? Well, we are exploring what might be next for Toyota. You can do a lot of analysis, but startups are experiments in the marketplace, and we want to help them with their disruptive technologies and business models come to market quickly and really prove out where the value is, which I'm going to talk about quite a bit more in a minute. The tear sheet on the fund is we're $200 million under management. We've done 25 investments since our founding in July 2017. So we've done about 25 deals in as many months. So we're kind of built for speed, which is often surprising from an automotive OEM. And that's because we are really built for speed. We are structured like a financial venture capital fund. We're a GP LP structure, two limited partners. We're aiming for financial return first and then strategic return. And we have a very tight board, and the structure is really financial VC or bust. So when in doubt, we look like a financial VC. If we can't, then we kind of fall back to something that makes sense for our corporate structure. But by and large, we're financially incented like a VC. We're built for speed like a VC. So how do we think about our portfolio? For this talk, there's a couple ways to look at it. One is basic technologies. So there's autonomy technology, there's robotics technologies, AI data cloud technologies that are foundational to how we think the world is going to change in the coming years. And then there's the applications that sit on top of that, and they could be in the home or in the enterprise. And these are typically robotics in the home and in the enterprise. And then on the mobility space, and we actually look at mobility very loosely. So if you look at autonomous vehicles, an autonomous self-driving car is really just a very large wheeled robot. And so we see a lot of the technologies being quite similar. And then if you go forward and you look into the mobility opportunities, we break them into sort of on the road is one set of real estate, and then the bike lane is another set of real estate where we haven't made an investment yet. And then on the sidewalk, where we just announced an investment in Skip Scooters, who we think has a more thoughtful approach to bringing scooters to market. And then outside of land, we also look at ocean autonomy with the investment in Sea Machines, and then obviously most germane for this audience, an air taxi investment in Joby Aviation. So this is our portfolio. I think I want to get a little bit of altitude and understand where we are. And I understand that you've heard a little bit about the Gartner's hype cycle, so I won't belabor it again. But there is an important point, and I think that the hype cycle kind of gets a bad name because you always hear the doomsayers come in and say, oh, we're at the peak and we're going to fall into the trough and it's going to be awful. But it's interesting because pre-hype, every product can do everything for everyone. In the immortal words of the legendary Saturday Night Live entrepreneur Dan Aykroyd, it's a floor wax and a dessert topping. And it can do everything. But post-hype, it can't do anything for anyone. The product and offering and the space is completely damaged, and there's no hope. What we call the trough of disillusionment. And then it kind of climbs out into this slope of enlightenment and productivity. Excuse me. So I spent a lot of the early part of my career working on avionics systems for launch vehicles in what's now Lockheed Martin. And when I saw this hype cycle, I said, wow, it looks a lot like a transient response. And most in this room know that transient responses govern a lot of the devices in our lives, from our thermostats in our home to automated cruise control and autopilots and things like that, where there's a position over time and then a target that's trying to be reached. This is a unit step response. And because the Gartner hype cycle looks a lot like this, I thought, what does it have to look like? This is not working too well. Hello, there we go. If you replace the position with market activity on the y-axis and the target with product market fit, it starts to look more and more like the Gartner hype cycle. But as those of you around in the room know, transient response has several modes. And so there's sort of the overdamped case, which is this sort of slow plodding toward the target. And then there's the runaway, where it doesn't even attempt to get to the target. Sort of, if you're automatic cruise control, just you put in the speed and it just careened off the road, accelerating to an unfortunate end. There's the critically damped case, where it's the fastest response with no overshoot, and then the underdamped case, where it overshoots quite quickly and then comes back in and settles into the target. And so if you think about business in this kind of sense, it's kind of instructive too. The lifestyle company is the overdamped case, where it's a sort of slow plodding toward product market fit, and it might be profitable in a few markets, but it doesn't really reach the market resonance that we as VCs like to see that result in 5+X return on investment. It's more sort of a mom and pop, and there's nothing wrong with the lifestyle company, but it's not really going to strike the market chord that really ends in mass adoption. The other side is the fiasco, which is this runaway where money chases vanity metrics, and there's really no attempt to hit the product with the market, and it just careens off into bankruptcy, typically. There's the fantasy case, which is, we see this pitch a lot, especially from first-time entrepreneurs that come in and say they have the perfect product market fit, great go-to-market, they're not going to have to raise any more money, they just need your investment, and then everything else will take care of itself. We pass on those deals typically. And then there's the reality, which is no one really knows where product market target is. And so we understand there's going to be an overshooting, but we welcome that, because good teams will pivot and settle into where the product fits the market. And so the underdamped case is the case that actually does the most in the shortest amount of time at the expense of wasting some resource. And that's the trade-off we're making in order to beat out the competition and actually prove whether the technology or space can actually deliver value into the market. So let's get a little more altitude. So Ray Dalio, for those that don't know, the founder of Bridgewater Associates, 160 billion under management, the world's largest hedge fund. If you haven't seen Ray's How the Economic Machine Works explainer video, go watch it, it's awesome. It's about 20 minutes. I recommended it to my 20-something sons, and they ridiculed me for recommending high school-like explainer videos with really cool, but really kind of pedantic animation. But it does really break down our economic cycle into three pieces. One is the productivity growth line, which kind of plods forward over time. The little squiggly curves that represents the economic cycle of expansion and recession that we see every 5 to 7 years. And the big sine wave that rides the little squiggly, which is the large leveraging over time, slow but large, and then the big deleveraging that happens every 75 to 100 years. We saw it last in 2010 and before that in the 1930s. So for our purposes, the big deleveraging, the big sine wave doesn't make a lot of sense. So let's take it out, and let's just have the productivity curve and the economic cycle right on top of it. And this looks very similar to our Gartner hype cycle rotated onto the productivity curve. And it's important to understand that if we didn't have debt, if we didn't have capital availability, we would have no squiggly lines. We would have no expansion and recession. We would just have this plodding productivity growth that was paid for with customer dollars, and it would be slow riding up that productivity curve. But the availability of debt actually accelerates this productivity search. And for our purposes, debt and equity are really the same thing. Whether it's return on investment in the form of interest or it's return on an investment in the form of equity appreciation, it's really an acceleration of the business cycle. And whenever you have that, you're going to have these sorts of expansion and recession. That's the way that the economy figures out what has value and what doesn't have value. So really, the hype cycle is necessary and sufficient to find value in the marketplace. The challenge is, of course, when things get kind of out of hand. And a few examples here of like why it's out of hand. This is from Bridgewater as well. Last year, tech startups made up 10% of the revenue of tech giants, like Amazon and Google and Facebook. 10% of their revenue came from startups. Startups accounted for 0.4% of global economic activity. 0.4% doesn't seem like a lot, but right before the dot-com crash of 2000, startups accounted for 0.6% of global economic activity. So we're about 2/3 there. So a lot of money is going into these startups, and we see that even now, like WeWork, very hyped company, slashed their IPO target by 75%, and now last week they've delayed the offering. So you start to see signs that we're kind of cresting that curve and pulling back a little bit and demanding more value be shown. So let's dive into the micro again. No, one more slide on this and this is for you guys. For aerospace investments, in the last 5 years, we've seen about a tripling of investments. So this actually does hit what we're talking about today. That 2015 spike is SpaceX. So there was quite a bit there. But even if you just kind of average it out, still triple roughly what it was before 2015. So we're seeing investment that's accelerating activity and innovation. What we really need to see is the other side. We need to see the productivity gains that come from those investments. So if you go back to the micro, this is sort of one hype cycle on top of our productivity growth curve. And it's really instructive from an investment perspective, because if you believe too much of the hype, it could really lead you astray. The FOMO, fear of missing out, affliction that hits investors like us, that we look around and like all the lemmings, we just jump. It's important to sort of step back and figure out where is the value being created. And when there's so much money chasing this innovation, it's really difficult to see it. But it's really quite corrosive. We've seen Series A rounds very early, like first money in, of hundreds of millions of dollars. And the problem is that it could really corrode the startup culture of a company. Venture capital has done a pretty good job over the last 40 years of funding companies in 18 to 24 months chunks. And it keeps everybody quite hungry. I've been in startups most of my career, just joined Toyota 3 years ago after we sold our last company to Microsoft after 3 years since its founding. And it's so important that we are in touch with two critical emotions, fear and greed. Fear of hitting the wall and suffering the pain and humiliation of a bankruptcy and disappointment of your investors, and also ambition for the upside. The love of the work and the colleagues and the mission is so important too, and that's why we go to work every day. But fear and greed really do govern quite a bit of the emotional roller coaster we're on. When an early company gets so much money invested, things become corrosive. Dalio says that one person's spending is another person's income. So when a startup culture sees all this money come in and all the beautiful facilities and the free lunches, they get confused. They get confused that the money didn't come from paying customers, but came from investors in exchange for equity. And they are not the same. And the executive team often knows that, but it doesn't necessarily filter down through the culture of the company. And so you lose that hunger, that fear, that drives startups. And I think it's really pernicious. And we will see how it turns out. But I think what it does is it really inflates prices. And then when the reckoning comes, it's very damaging to the market, to the industry. And then we're starting to see some of that. So how do we translate this into our investment process? And we're going to do a judging contest, startup pitch contest later. So I'll give you a little foreshadow of what we look for. We look for startups that are focusing on productivity, right? We want startups that are aiming for that productivity curve, that product market fit that will deliver real value to real customers. And we start with financial criteria. And the first thing we look for is the company. What can the company control? Well, they can control their team, their product and technology, and their business model. And the most important element of these three is not product and technology, is actually the team. I always look for this balance between confidence and humility. Enough confidence to have the courage of your convictions, but not so much that you're arrogant and insensitive. Because the other side of this is humility. Not so much humility that you're insecure, but enough humility to listen to the market. Mike Tyson has this great quote that no fight plan survives the first punch in the mouth. And the startup analogy to this is no go-to-market plan ever survives first contact with the customer. And it requires a certain level of resilience and sensitivity to manage through that harsh reality. The other side is the market, and this is to scale. So we tend to look about 50% at the company, about 35% of the market. And is it big enough? Is it broken? And can the company help fix that brokenness? Is it ready? And then does it have a way to reach the market? Many markets are big and broken, but they're not ready. I would argue 10 years ago rather, automotive really wasn't ready for change. And I think that has changed. Government markets typically aren't ready. And there's certain markets that you need to kind of understand the timing. There's an old rule of thumb that says as soon as a company takes its first venture capital dollar, they've lit a 5-year fuse on the company. And so I think it was John Maynard Keynes that said the market can be irrational longer than you can be solvent. And so you have to realize as an entrepreneur that as soon as you take money, you better figure it out because you have about a 5-year lifetime. And then finally, the deal itself. About 15% we look at the deal. Is it priced right? I mean, the hype cycle isn't bad unless you buy at peak hype. If you buy early enough or late enough, you can still make money because that plateau of productivity, as long as it's higher than your buy price, you can make money on the deal. So price does matter. And then in early stage, financing risk is also important. Are there experienced, helpful investors at the table with you to see the company through its success? And then strategically, for us, for Toyota, like I said, we are looking over the horizon for what might be next for Toyota. Toyota wasn't always a car company. Toyota started making industrial looms, textile making machinery. and it pivoted into cars. That pivot worked out okay. But what might be next for Toyota? Toyota is a top 10 consumer brand, and there's a lot Toyota could do to leverage that brand. So we tend to look strategically, could this be one day a business that could be interesting to Toyota? And then secondly, again, to scale, what's planned? What's in the hopper at Toyota? And that's sort of a 5 to 10 year look of what is planned. And then we really don't like deals that are really focused too much on the here and now, because we don't really feel like that is what venture capital is appropriate for. So you can learn more about us on the internets, and we do a blog, and we have a talent network that could plug interesting folks into our startups. We're on the Twitters and LinkedIns, and look forward to hearing a few of your questions if we have time. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Jim?
Wow.
Is there a question in the back? No, we have got one. Sorry, they have. Yeah, great.
Just waiting for the mic, yeah. Just how do you evaluate if a market will become rational in the next 2 years or not? I assume you don't want a market that's fully already rational, otherwise there's 20 VCs already in there, right? So there's like a magic timing window. How do you get it?
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it is why 2/3 of the portfolio won't return capital, because we get it wrong. And so we like to see some level of indication. The whole market doesn't have to be ready at once, but you have to find sort of the thin end of the wedge of what is the initial go-to-market, and is there enough to generate some level of traction and validation to get to that next level and the next level. I think for many of the markets that makes some sense. I think in some of the markets, for what you all are interested in, that's tougher because there's a regulatory overlay that kind of pushes everything out. So you have to really be sure that, as someone said in the last panel, if you build it, they will come. If the regulators will let you, then the customer base will be there. In other markets where there's no regulation and you're not completely sure, you have to have some visibility into some initial traction that sort of proves a little bit of the go-to-market and the productivity offered to these customers relatively soon. That's why we do the 18 to 24 month investment, so we get a little sense of it, but never perfect, never even close. But we do the best we can.
Great, and you will be back for pitch later.
Yeah,
so.
I'll be back this afternoon. So anything else? Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much. Thanks.